Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And first off today, I want to have a conversation about what is happening with the 58th Combined Arms Army of the Russian Federation. Recently, it is being reported, at least here in mainstream media, that the commander, General Popov, of that unit has reportedly been sacked by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, before I get into this conversation, I think it's important to understand that this is not uncommon. We see these sorts of shakeups. It happens here in the United States. And if you recall the feud, the challenges, so to speak, that Rumsfeld, then Secretary of Defense, had with General Shinseki. General Shinseki, I don't know if you guys remember this or not, but during the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, General Shinseki, before Congress, reported that the U.S. military would need a couple of 100,000 troops to garrison and occupy Iraq. Obviously, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, in that group that were planning the Iraqi invasion did not agree with that. They did not agree with the opinion of a highly regarded general. Now, was that a general that tended to play for the other side in terms of the body politic of the United States? Yes, he was he went on to serve Democratic presidents, meaning Shinseki did. So there was that covert relationship that existed between Rumsfeld and Shinseki, that political relationship. But at the same time, at the end of the day, Shinseki was right. He was correct. They did need a couple of 100,000 troops to maintain security in Iraq. And obviously we know what happened, and we know how long the United States was in Iraq during that period of time. And to make a long story short, some believe that Shinseki had to shorten his military career and was essentially pushed out of the U.S. military by Rumsfeld. Now, here we are today. Commander of the 58th Army Group is, again, allegedly sacked by the Russian Ministry of Defense. So first, let's have a look at the Russian 58th Combined Arms Army. Obviously, this is a very important component of both the Russian military and the Russian strategy for operations against the Ukrainians. If you look at the makeup of the 58th Combined Arms Army, what it is as of 2021, it was made up of the 19th Motorized Rifle Division. It also included the 42nd Guards Motorized Rifle Division that is based in and around Chechnya. It also comprises the 136th Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 12th Rocket Brigade, the 67th Anti-Aircraft Rocket Brigade, the 291st Artillery Brigade, the 100th Reconnaissance Brigade, also including the 4th Guards Military Base, which is based in South Ossetia. And then you have the 34th Headquarters Brigade, the 40th NBC Protection Regiment, it's a nuclear, biological, and chemical unit, 31st Engineer Sapper Regiment, 78th Logistics Support Brigade, 14th Electronic Warfare Battalion. We constantly hear about the 1st Guards Tank Army as being the one of the premier Russian army groups. There are many that believe, in actuality, the 58th Army and those army groups that are based in the southern military district of the Russian Federation are, from a qualitative viewpoint, probably the best in the Russian Federation. So constantly hear about 1st Guards Tank Army, but the reality is some of the more competent units are actually in some of those southern military districts. Now, recently, obviously, when the war between Russia and Ukraine kicked off, the 58th Combined Arms Army, the 22nd Army Group based in Crimea, they probably had the most success of any area of operation for Russian forces. We know what happened to Kiev. We know what happened in Sumy, and we know what's happening right now in the rest of the areas of the theaters of operations. But the 58th Combined Arms Army, in those units in the south, which launched its operations from Crimea into what was essentially southern Ukraine, now Novorossiya, occupied by Russian forces, and in all probability remain so. But they had probably, again, the most success. They were able to capture a major city. Kherson was seized, and they had gotten close to Mykolaiv and were pressing deep into Ukrainian lines and behind Ukrainian lines before the Russians pulled back into what we're seeing now in terms of what is happening now within this conflict. Now, what happened with General Popov? We really don't know. Ultimately, we don't know what happened. Now, what we do know that may have occurred was that a few days ago, there was a Ukrainian attack on a headquarters position of the 58th Combined Arms Army. And the deputy commander of the 58th Combined Arms Army, Lieutenant General Oleg Sokov, I believe that's how you say that. Please correct me if I'm wrong. It is believed that he may have been killed in this Berdyansk strike. Now, the Ukrainians probably use Storm Shadow. They probably use some other long-range weapon system provided by their Western handlers, their Western supporters. Now, after that strike occurred, after the killing of the deputy commander, a colleague of General Popov, apparently conversations occurred between General Popov, and higher echelons of the Russian military, Shoigu, Gerasimov. Apparently, Popov made claims that the capabilities in regards to counter battery fire, in all probability, the ability of Russian forces to protect areas such as locales like Berdyansk. Obviously, the Russians are taking casualties in this conflict. It's a very bloody war. We're seeing new technologies being used, and both sides, East, West, are learning a very, very tough game. Modern war, high-intensity war with two industrialized nations. Talked about this at the very onset of this conflict. This is what we were going to see. It was going to be a very tough fight. Very tough fight. And that's where it's at. And I believe, and again, this is just my opinion, that the resulting strike on Berdyansk that killed Popov's colleague, his deputy commander, his subordinate, that obviously may have had an effect on him. I mean, a strike deep behind Russian lines that kills a colleague, in which you are possibly at a headquarters area that you may believe is relatively safe. And that may have occurred, which led to these conversations with Popov and Gerasimov. And then ultimately, possibly ending in the sacking of General Popov. So tough to say what actually may have happened. The conversations. There was additional reported conversations as well regarding counter battery fire at the front, about the rotation of forces, that General Popov may believe that those forces have been on the main front lines too long and they needed rest. And that comes into play as well. But definitely an interesting situation unfolding. It's never a good look, I mean, for really any armed forces, for the unity of command, when you have generals disputing. When you have, by all accounts, a very competent battlefield commander. Well, maybe not a battlefield commander, but a army group commander. A commander who commands multiple divisions. A commander who commands. I'm starting to sound like Kamala Harris. Please forgive me. Anyway. So again, not a good look. But at the end of the day, what happens? I imagine that General Popov continues to have a career in the Russian military. Obviously, any strike on a headquarters and the killing of colleagues is tough. And again, it could have had an impact on his messaging to his leadership. And that's probably what happened. But outside of that, obviously the war continues. Again, there's not a lot of movement on the front lines. Again, I've talked about this before. I'm definitely going to get the pushback from the Ukrainian supporters that believe there's the possibility of a successful outcome of this counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces, which is not happening. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, the Ukrainian offensive, especially the offensive that occurred running from Orikhiv east to Volhodar, failed. It did not achieve a breakthrough. There were very large amounts of Ukrainian casualties, and I would have to say that this offensive was unsuccessful. Now, is it possible that the Ukrainians regroup and launch another offensive? Yeah, it is, but ultimately, I firmly believe that without an air force, the same thing is going to occur. Yeah, the Ukrainians may achieve some battlefield success. They may have some success in striking a headquarters of the Russian forces, i.e. what we just talked about. But ultimately, will the Ukrainians be successful in capturing large areas of territory? Will they be successful in breaking through the Russian front lines? Probably not. Probably not unless they get an air force, or they are then directly supported by NATO air forces, which could change the dynamics on the ground, obviously, but then would lead to an expansion of the conflict. Without a doubt, an expansion of the conflict. But at the end of the day, I think after seeing that strike down towards Berdyansk that attacked that headquarters of the Russian 58th Army, I have to ask myself that if we fast forward 20 years into the future, 30 years into the future, if the world survives this conflict and the next conflict that occurs after this, will we hear that U.S. stealth aircraft were directly involved in this war? Is it possible that U.S. stealth assets were used in direct strikes against Russian forces? Is it possible? Talked about this before. Now, if the United States, as the war started and continued, and the United States was analyzing Russian capabilities, and the United States believed, the CIA believed, the NSA believed that it could operate over Ukraine without the Russians knowing. And I mean operate on a tactical level, meaning direct intervention in the conflict. Would the U.S. do it? You have to ask yourself that question. If the U.S. believed that they could conduct strikes against Russian forces and give plausible deniability to the Ukrainians because it was difficult for the Russians to monitor those stealth assets, would the U.S. do it? I'm asking you, the viewer, that. Would the U.S. do it? And that's ultimately something that you have to ask yourself. And then ultimately, into the future, we may become more aware of just how deeply the U.S., the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United Kingdom, was involved in this conflict. And I think it's going to be much greater than what anyone currently understands. Thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.